Hi everyone, it's Alex, and in honor of Pride Month, I knew I wanted to make a video talking about LGBTQ stories or narratives, and in particular, I really wanted to talk about a movie called Beginners. Beginners is one of my favorite movies, even outside of it being an LGBTQ film, but the movie revolves around a man named Oliver, who is the son of Hal, and it's really about Hal telling Oliver that he's gay, although Hal at the same time is dying of cancer and he's very well into his life, probably like in his 80s. And really the whole film follows Oliver and how Oliver is kind of handling two things, and the first is with his father dying, but also Oliver kind of adjusting to his father's new lifestyle. And while also thinking of the movie Beginners, and also lately binge watching Queer Eye, and really just thinking about, with other things I'm going to talk about here in context, I feel like right now in our world we are taking this shift where, being a part of the LGBTQ community is getting an overwhelmingly positive reception, which I feel like in comparison, especially thinking of LGBTQ stories in the past, always being defined by things like being plagued by suffering. And of course with things like suffering, one may think immediately of the AIDS crisis, and whenever I read Tin Man last month, it does mention the AIDS crisis while also being an LGBTQ story, but it acknowledges it without really meditating or dwelling on that suffering. So while reading Tin Man, it made me think of sort of other things I've noticed, or what I think are somewhat trademarks of LGBTQ stories. And I'll preface this video by saying that my thoughts in this video are completely my own. I'm not necessarily saying there's cause for reform based on these other things or stories I'll be talking about along with Beginners, but I just wanted to make a note of that. But for me, the movie Beginners, I think as a story, I think it does a great job at sort of subverting those themes or trademarks I think of when it comes to LGBTQ narratives or stories. And one of those themes is the absence of betrayal. For example, when I think of stories like Call Me By Your Name by Andre Osman, I do enjoy and appreciate very much how this story kind of goes ahead and gets out of the way the idea of family secrecy or family betrayal. In Elio's case in this story, our protagonist here, who takes up much of the narration of this story, opposite of Oliver. We never get Oliver's perspective of Elio's sort of obsession over him, but we also do get Elio's mother's and father's perspective of his growing sexuality. So again, there isn't really any sense of betrayal here, because where Elio's family, first of all, living in Europe and having more of a European lifestyle, and his family being intellectuals and academics, they are more appreciative of understanding things like sexuality. Similarly, whenever I think of stories like Aristotle and Dante discovered the secrets of the universe, I also appreciate sort of that absence of betrayal when it does come to Aristotle coming into terms with his sexuality, and similarly with Call Me By Your Name, not having to necessarily undergo that weight of secrecy with his own parents as well. And lastly, thinking of things just as recent as the movie Love, Simon, which I know is also based on a book, I also appreciate sort of that absence of betrayal with Simon coming into terms with his own sexuality. Although with his parents it's a bit different, but I'll be talking about that later. Kind of the idea where now, I feel like that movie is such a positive example of how your friends are just as much a resource along with going through other normal teen things like dating, relationships, and of course in Simon's case, coming out as gay. So moving on with similar themes, along with an absence of betrayal, I also think of or notice these recurring themes of a sacrifice of masculinity. So again, thinking of Aristotle and Dante, now thinking of more of things, especially when thinking of masculinity, and I know masculinity is a construct, but even here, it seems like all of these characters that I've already mentioned, whether from this book, Call Me By Your Name, or Love, Simon, it seems like in Aristotle's case here, there is a point whenever Aristotle does discover that another character in this book is being harassed physically by others, and Aristotle's immediate response is to use his physicality and his strength to intimidate and kind of threaten these people. So this really extends to me thinking about how violence is used as this other thing on a scale. So on one side you have being able to express your sexuality, but on the other it seems like you have what you can do with violence in comparison. While also thinking of Call Me By Your Name and also this kind of idea of sacrificing your masculinity, there are points in here where Elio, as well as Oliver, they kind of demonstrate their sexuality as a way of sacrificing their masculinity. If thinking, of course, or interpreting that sacrificing your masculinity equates with, in my own thoughts, just hypothetically speaking, that you lose your masculinity when coming out, it seems like a way that Elio and Oliver regain that sense of masculinity is by sort of experimenting on the woman around them in which they live, which for me I think is a shame, because I feel like the woman here written, as well as in the movie, I wish it could have done or been done better, but I understand why. I know, of course, like I said earlier, all of these stories, I think they have their good qualities, and I think they are made for unique audiences, but often when I hear of this story, I appreciated this story more because of that intimacy of Elio being able to find out things for himself. Whereas from other people who I know enjoy this book or the movie, they love the idea of sort of sexuality somewhat as spectacle to kind of, again, it goes back to that idea of betrayal, something like, will people find out about them? And things like, I guess in a way, relationship among men, it's sort of, I guess, interesting to some people because they don't get to be exposed to that very often. And lastly, thinking of sacrifice of masculinity with Love, Simon, there is a point which I thought was kind of strange about, of course, where Simon's sort of grappling with trying to find out who this Blue character is. To kind of get there, Simon does use intimidation tactics with a specific character and somewhat threatens to bully someone. So again, there's that presence of maybe violence, or assuming, if you will, violence equals masculinity. So I think that's just interesting, where it seems like to have your presence of a sexuality, you have to remind people that you're also masculine in this type of way. And lastly, that brings up the point that I think of a lot kind of in our new generation of LGBTQ stories, or at least exposed to me. I'm sure there are other stories out there that I'm not aware of that sort of talk about these things differently. But lastly, I think of what makes a happy ending. So again, in Call Me By Your Name's case, maybe a happy ending is, of course, this is actually all told in the memory by Elio. It's not really happening in the present day. It's all sort of reflecting. So even then, maybe a happy ending here is sort of being able to have that sense of nostalgia or dreamlike, hazy summer memory where everything was beautiful and great. In Aristotle and Dante's case, maybe the idea of a happy ending is getting that familial support, as well as being able to experience your sexuality with someone else undergoing it at the same time. And lastly, with Love, Simon's case, it's interesting because, of course, like I mentioned earlier with Simon, the plot taking much of finding out who this Blue character is that he's corresponding with. Being able to try to secure a relationship with this character at the end of the novel or the story, to me, it makes me think, does a happy ending mean also being in a relationship with someone at the same time finding out about your sexuality? For me personally speaking, I'm not a very intimate person, and I appreciate relationships, but I felt like when I watched Love, Simon in particular, I kind of stopped relating whenever there was this fixation on being in a relationship. To me, I wish there were stories out there that acknowledged, positive affirmations of discovering your sexuality without necessarily having to want or desire a relationship at the same time. So of course, that finally brings me to talking about the movie Beginners. So first off, thinking of betrayal in Beginners, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's interesting with the dynamic of fatherhood in Beginners with Hal and Oliver. In all of the books or stories I previously mentioned other than Beginners, it's interesting because it seems like the aspect of betrayal comes from at least the son wondering what his family or at least his father would think. And in Oliver's case, Oliver's the one that kind of has to take or acknowledge or accept what his father is coming into terms with his own sexuality. So the roles were reversed. And the idea of fatherhood, I think, extends to that sacrifice of masculinity, mainly because already Hal and Oliver, they both are very, for the lack of a better term, tender characters. They don't necessarily always, present this idea of masculinity, whatever that is to you, but at least to me, maybe for me, I would think it's Oliver in the film. He does develop this relationship with a woman. So being able to have Oliver as this sort of perspective or gaze as an audience member of witnessing his father's sexuality, I think that's really interesting. Because for Oliver's case, as the son, he can't really have to wonder or change his masculinity in any way, because whatever is happening to him because of his father coming out isn't really about him, it's about his father. And thinking of Hal, again, Oliver's father, throughout the movie, Hal does take the chance, even while dying of cancer at the same time, to feel very open about discovering what it's like in the LGBT community. He even calls Oliver at one scene and he asks him, or he actually starts like trying to play out with his own words what a type of music is. And then Oliver says, "Oh, I think that's house music. That's what it's called." This is even more interesting to me just because where Hal is a much older character, it seems like to me, I think society sort of deems older people either as, of course, non-existent, but certainly people Hal's age, who's probably in his 80s or so, that they sort of lose masculinity as they age. But throughout the movie, Hal makes it clear that he's very interested in dating other men, even to the point of being in a relationship with a younger man, and then how Oliver is able to sort of grapple with all of that. And again, thinking of betrayal, how Oliver, you can imagine, again, thinking of fatherhood and what that means between a father and son. Also this idea of clearly Hal was able to have Oliver as a child with Oliver's mother. And the movie also explores motherhood and makes it complex, which affects Oliver's relationship with this woman in the film that he ends up having. And really all of that is to say that there's another scene between Oliver and this woman that he develops a relationship with. That there's a scene where they start talking about naming things and eventually how you can give names pretty much to anything, whatever you want to call it. And then this woman character, she says something that's always stuck with me. She says, there's one half of people that believe something bad is always going to happen, and then there's the other half that always believes in magic. So to me, that was clear that Oliver's the one that sort of probably believes in something bad always about to happen, and Hal is the one that believes in magic. And that's all to say, again, bringing it back to what is a happy ending. I think Beginners shows that happiness, first of all, is capable in whatever point in your life, mainly because Oliver, he talks about having many failed relationships with women, and in a way it almost seems like Oliver he does admire Hal as his father, and he sees Hal being happy despite his current obstacles. And again, sort of talking about that point I made earlier about how I wish there were maybe more stories that didn't necessarily have to focus on being in a relationship as the last thing to do, sort of. And Hal does make it clear he does want to be in a relationship, and that is what makes him happy, which is fair. But I think in the larger scheme of things, that Beginners is very much a movie about accepting yourself and being able to always find yourself at any stage in your life. I'll definitely leave a link to Beginners, like the trailer for it, down in the description box in case you're interested. I really recommend checking that movie out. And to me, I feel like this video felt kind of scatterbrained, but I try to keep it as cohesive as possible. So depending whatever thoughts you have on anything I said, I would love to know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.